Welcome to our discussion. We're so glad that you have joined us. My name is Norm Peckham, and I have with me Dr. Ariel Roth, scientist, author. We're so glad that you're here with us once again. Now, this is the third in a series of 3 lectures on the great Genesis flood, the thing that has created so much consternation and confusion and discussion between science and the Bible. And the farther we get into it, it seems like the wider the separation gets. Why does this flood cause, or the flood idea, cause those in mainstream science so much angst?
Well, you know, this affects our basic outlook, our basic philosophy. Is there a God? Did we evolve? Is the Bible true? Yeah. These are questions that people ask, and the flood is the one event that can reconcile those geological layers in the fossils to the creation account, to a recent creation. We had a recent creation, then we had the flood. And without that flood, you're usually going to these millions, indeed billions of years for some kind of evolutionary process, or maybe God took billions of years to do it, which is not at all what the Bible says.
And they don't want to deal with a model of the origins that includes a God.
Well, yes, or if they include the God, they don't want to include a God that, you know, is just like the one described in the Bible. But there is some kind of God, but, you know, not the Bible.
But it is a huge problem. Now, last time we gave several different points that we talked about, that there are huge sedimentary layers, but they're all stacked up on dry land now, not out in oceans where you would expect them. In those layers, there is evidence of turbidites, we call them, but they're layers of mud that travel very fast underwater, and they leave a footprint that can be seen. They're extremely widespread deposits, some 400,000 square miles is the Morrison Formation, and we'll see it there as flat as it can be. In these long time periods where supposedly the dinosaurs roamed the earth, in some of those layers where the animals are found, there's no plant material for them to eat. And so it's an incomplete ecological system. It makes it very hard to understand how that model could indeed be true. And there are many, many coal deposits around the earth, and if the plant material was sitting out on the surface of the earth, exposed to the sun, the rain, and the wind, how would it fossilize there? How would it even remain there? So this time we have a couple more evidences that you're going to give to us, and so let's go right to that.
Just wanted to mention, as we introduce this topic this time, that we have these tremendous layers out there, and did they develop over billions of years, as is normally suggested by the geological community, or are they the result of the flood? And in this picture, we have that red arrow picture of the Grand Canyon. Those layers above that arrow we would generally put in the flood. They have lots of fossils. Below it, hardly any fossils. They're microscopic in size and so on. So this is the issue. Were those layers above that arrow laid down by the Genesis flood? And there are many layers above what you've seen here in this thing.
We talk about long geologic ages. How does that relate to what we're talking about here with respect to these layers?
Well, you don't have the long geologic ages in the biblical model. These layers were all laid down rapidly by the flood. In contrast, there are suggestions that no, these layers were laid down over billions of years. The 2 models could hardly be different. You're familiar with erosion. And, you know, rivers carry material to the oceans. How fast do these rivers carry this material? Well, you can go in and day out to the mouth of the river, and you can determine this. How fast are these continents being eroded away? And how long can these continents survive? And so, as we look at these rates of erosion, we find evidence that, hey, the biblical model seems more reasonable than the billions of years, because the continents could not stand that much erosion for those long periods of time.
All of the dirt would get washed away?
Erosion is way, way too fast for the billions of years suggested, and that fits better with the idea that the continents are not that old. For instance, here we have a diagram of an island there sitting in the ocean, and blue lines represent rivers. The rivers carry sediments into the ocean, and you can see a little bit of sediment going there at the oceans at the mouth of the rivers, and you can calculate how much sediment is going into the ocean, and you can tell how long that island is going to last before it's worn down by erosion. And you can do exactly the same thing for continents. And this has been done for all the continents of the world, all the major rivers of the world, many studies. You have a list here, you probably can't read all the details on this, but a list of 12 different studies indicating that, hey, these rates of erosion are way too fast. The average for these 12 different studies is that the rivers of the world are carrying about 24,000 million metric tons per year. Now, so how long would the continents last under that?
Yeah.
Well, you calculate out, average height of the continents is 623 meters, and you figure out the weight of your sediments carried by the rivers and so on, and our continents should be eroded away in 10 million years.
Now, 10 million years is a tiny little fraction of the hundreds of billions of years.
The 3 or 4 billion years that they say are the ages of the continents. Well, this about a half a century ago, this came to the attention of some geologists.
Dott and Batten in the book Evolution of Earth, and they say, North America is being denuded at a rate that could level it in a mere 10 million years. Or put it another way, at the same rate, 10 North Americas could have been eroded since the Middle Cretaceous time, 100 million years ago. 10 times.
Yeah, and Cretaceous is near the top of the
near the top of the list. Now, if that were to happen, there would be no geologic column left.
Right. But it's still there.
It's still there.
Well, another corollary to this is, again, going on with these authors, is that here these rivers are carrying all this sediment. How long is it going to take to fill up the oceans? Here's a comment they make. They say, if, for instance, we had this going on for 1 billion years, they say, then we would expect a staggering 30,000 meter thick layer of sediments to cover the seafloor today.
30,000 meters.
There's only about 300 meters of sediment in the ocean now. It's only about 1% of what you'd expect in 1 billion years. And the continents are supposed to be several billion years old. And they comment appropriately. They say, apparently we have erred badly in making our assumptions. Let me illustrate this with this picture here of the continents of the world. You've got continents of yellow and the gray-green ocean there. Keep washing this material from the continents into the oceans. You expect the oceans to fill up. Now, in certain places in the ocean, we have trenches, and sediment is supposed to go down in those trenches, and geologists say, well, that would take care of it. But if you measure the amount of sediment going down in the trenches, it's only about 10 to 20% of what the rivers carry. It's not an answer to this at all. Erosion is way too fast. Of course, you don't have enough sediments in the continent to fill the oceans.
Right.
The oceans are about 6 times as deep as continents are high on an average. But if you had renewal from below, as is proposed in the cycles of geological cycles of the rocks where the continents are neutral below and eroded on top and so on. You could have a constant source of sediment there over that time, and you'd expect these figures, and it's not there. The data just does not fit with the long geologic ages, but it would fit much better with the idea in the Bible that, hey, things
happen a little quicker.
And geologic columns there, but it was a result of the flood. But it has not been eroded away even once. As an example of that, here are just some layers. This is in France. These layers are supposed to be about 150 million years old and so on, folded around in various ways and so on. But it just illustrates to you that why aren't these eroded away? If the erosion rates are as fast as they are at present, and these things are that old, they should have been washed away a long time ago. There should be no geologic column left because we're going through these cycles several times. You could actually erode your continents 100 times. I'm being very conservative here, 100 times in geologic time and so on. And yet the geologic layers are still there. We haven't gone through even one cycle of this.
My, flat gaps. What on earth do you mean by flat gaps?
Well, this is a confusing term, but it's you have to keep in mind two things. We're talking, one, they're flat, and secondly, they're a gap. How can you have a gap in between rock layers?
Well, we've been out there and looked at those things. It's rock on rock, so there's no gap in there.
Well, what we mean by that is that there's a time gap.
Oh, it's not an air gap, it's a time gap.
There's a time gap. And the way you tell that there's a gap is because in other places you have layers that are missing where you have the gap.
And those layers have been assigned a particular amount of time.
Yes.
Okay.
Here's an example of a flat gap. We're here in the Grand Canyon. You see this layer going across the whitish layer right at near the tip of the red arrow.
Yes.
Now, at the very tip of the red arrow, there's a flat gap. It's between that whitish layer that you see and the more reddish layers below it. And that gap is supposed to be 6 million years. How do they tell it's 6 million years? Well, you go 150 miles south of here, near Sedona, Arizona, and there you have the Schnebly Hills Formation. That Schnebly Hills Formation is supposed to have taken 6 million years, and it lies right between that whitish layer there and the reddish layer below.
So elsewhere in the Earth, there is a layer between these two layers that has been assigned a time value of 6 million years. But when you get over here, that layer is not there, so we say there's a gap in time.
Right. And
why is that a problem?
Well, because in 6 million years you'd expect all kinds of erosions according to our average rates of erosion. Remember those 12 studies I mentioned to you? In 6 million years you expect about 600 feet of erosion. And look how flat the contact is there.
So if that were the surface of the Earth for 6 million years, you'd expect rain and wind and all the natural forces that erode today to carve it out like the Grand Canyon looks right here.
Yes. And Grand Canyon's a good example. Look how irregular erosion tends to be. This diagram tells you a little bit of just about what we've been talking about there. In the middle of the diagram, you see a red line clear across. It's just below the kind of pinkish layer, and below it's a darker buff pink layer. But that red line is your flat gap.
Okay.
And the brown layer that you see to the right is the way they determine how long the time is in that gap, because they would say that brown layer maybe took 6 million years to be laid down. And since that brown layer is not in the region where we have the red line, we'd say, well, we've got a gap of 6 million years. And during that time, you'd expect a lot of erosion, illustrated by the green line, you see, expected erosion, while that brown layer is being laid down to the right, and no layer is being laid down to the left. You'd expect a lot of erosion there. but we don't see, those layers seem to be extremely flat. You find occasionally a little bit of erosion, but it tends to be extremely flat. Here's a picture of erosion to illustrate to you how irregular it is. This is the Colorado River in Utah. Erosion tends to be irregular, and we should expect this kind of at these extended gaps here and so on. Here's a pattern of what we see and what we might expect. The top diagram, there are four of them there, you see under the right. Top diagram shows you flat laying down layers, which is normal. Then if you have a time when that stops, the continent's lifted up or something else and so on, you'd expect a lot of irregular erosion, as you can see in the second diagram. And if you start laying down layers on top, as you would, normally, you'd be able to pick up that old erosional pattern, which is the white line. Mm-hmm. And you ought to see this throughout the layers because erosion tends to be so irregular. But what we see is really what's in the bottom diagram, and that these layers tend to be quite flat there, as though they've been laid down rapidly, as expected during the Genesis flood.
As you would in a flood.
As you expect in the biblical model of origins and so on. Well, here's another diagram that says about the same thing. This diagram, the white layers are the rock layers, but we've put it on a time scale, so that the gaps are in black. There are no rocks there, but the black represents the gaps. And the thicker the black lines, the longer the gap. That great big thick black layer towards the bottom there is 140 million years. You'd expect a lot of erosion in 140 million years.
There's a very irregular line that is pointed to by the red arrow that goes through up and down through those layers. That represents what? Well,
that's present topography right now. It shows you the irregular erosion we have now. This diagram is compressed laterally about 15 times and so on. This diagram represents 130 kilometers, or about 83 miles across in a region. This is northeast of the Grand Canyon. And the green line, which is dashed and so on, again, very highly irregular. The surface of our Earth shows what erosion does. But when we look at the layers, it seems to be quite flat.
Yeah.
Occasionally a little bit of erosion, but they seem to be quite flat, and suggesting, hey, these were laid down rapidly, not over these millions of years, suggested by the geological time scale. Well, let me show you some examples here of a few of these gaps. This is a Dead Horse Point in Utah. And, the red arrow there points to a 10 million gap. Look how flat those layers are. We'd expect 1,000 feet of erosion during that time. The arrow at the left points to a very flat layer, 20 million year gap. You'd expect right there. And you expect about 2,000 feet of erosion there. These look as though they were laid down very rapidly. You don't see the erosion you'd expect. This is 200 miles southwest. And we have there that same 10 million year gap I showed you before. The layers above are gone, but
200 miles.
These are not local situations. Extremely widespread layers. And you have that 10 million year gap still there, and you don't see any significant evidence of erosion. Get to the Grand Canyon. We already talked about that 6 million year gap at the top, but there are others in the Grand Canyon. And the second arrow down points to a 14 million year gap. You'd expect 1,400 feet of erosion there. The lower arrow, if you're familiar with your geologic column and so on, the Ordovician and the Silurian are missing in that lower gap. Wow. And it's over 100 million years. And you'd expect 10,000 feet of erosion. Your whole canyon's only 5,000 feet. It looks as though these things were laid down rapidly, as you expect during this horrific Genesis flood. And we can go on here with some more examples. This is in Texas. At the end of that top arrow, we got a 200 million year gap. You'd expect, you know, maybe 20,000 feet of erosion. Then a 16 million year gap below there at the top of the reddish layer at the end of that arrow. These are found throughout the region. They're hard to tell because the gap doesn't show up. There's no evidence that that time took place. But if you look at the fossils and you look at the dating, normally dating and so on, you can discover these. Here's a gap of 190 million years in Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona. And it's barely perceptible. It's just the grayish layer right above the reddish layer there. Soft material. How could that stay there for? There's a little bit of erosion you see at this gap also, but not very much. Well, Norman Newell has made a
real interesting statement here about these flat gaps, or otherwise known as paraconformities. The origin of paraconformities is uncertain, and I certainly do not have a simple solution to this problem. Well spoken.
Yes. And he tried to suggest, well, maybe these were beaches, very widespread beaches. But these are not beach deposits in most of these. This is not an answer to this problem at all.
No.
It's a problem. It's one that is not discussed very much in the scientific literature. But it's very real when you go out there and look at those layers. You're very impressed with this.
You tend not to talk a lot about something you don't know anything about.
Well, you know, we're all human.
That's right.
Here's a map of the world, and I just wanted to point out to you, we've talked about some of these gaps here in the western United States, but if time is missing in the western United States, it's missing everywhere. And you can pretty well eliminate most of the geolite column by gaps in various places. Just a couple examples of other places besides North America where we have some of these gaps. You're looking right here in Switzerland. This is in the Rhone Valley in Switzerland. Right at the end of that arrow, you can see a dark line going across.
Yeah.
At that dark line, we have about a 45 million year gap, and we'd expect all kinds of erosion there. It's not there.
Well, the surface up there sure is eroded, but not down there.
Yeah, well, this is, again, an illustration. The contrast between erosion and these flat gaps is striking. Here's another example. This is in Australia. Along the east coast of Australia, at the end of that red arrow, you have a 6 million year gap. If you look up towards the upper right-hand corner, at least, you can see a bus on the road up there for scale. But the interesting thing about this gap, it sits right on top of a coal seam. The question is, could the coal or the vegetation that made that coal sit there for 6 million years?
As the surface of the Earth?
Yes. And this is fairly widespread in the Sydney Basin. This gap here, right, fairly widespread in the Sydney Basin, and you wonder, you know, man, it sure looks like this was laid down rapidly, like you'd expect during the Genesis flood. Another example in Venezuela. Van Andel, geologist, talks about an experience he had. He was there looking at two coal seams. They were separated by a foot according to the standard geological time scale. One was lower Paleocene, the upper was upper Eocene age, but there was 15 million years between those two layers.
Wow.
And as he states right here, he says, but even the closest inspection failed to turn up the precise position of that 15 million year gap. So here he was looking at this, and you'd expect 15 million years to leave a lot of evidence. And here he could not find it, and he said he was very impressed with this.
Well, and rightly he should be impressed because it is a conundrum that has bothered geologists and science for the whole debate. But it gives somebody who will go to Scripture and read the Bible, this kind of thing supports that view when it doesn't support and doesn't lend good evidence for the long geologic ages. And so, coming to the end of our discussion, we want to reiterate that we've given two major ideas this evening. One, that the rate of erosion that we see going on around us today would level the continents 100 times if that rate were kept up over the geologic time. And because we still have a geologic column, we know it hasn't even gone through one cycle. And so, how would you put that together with long geologic ages? And then, of course, the flat gaps, where you have the surface of the earth for millions of years, virtually no erosion, they are essentially flat. Well, those are a couple of problems that may give problems to the evolutionary model, but it's certainly no problem if you want to read Scripture and see how it was done there. We'll be back again when we discuss more about where is truth. If you would like additional free information about these discussions, there is a PowerPoint resource available on the Internet that covers many more details than could be provided in this lecture series. The resource is titled The Bible and Science and is available at scienceandscriptures.com. Be sure to add an S at the end of the word Scriptures to get to the right web page. The Bible and Science resource follows the same sequence of topics as the Where is Truth series, but it is divided into 17 separate discussions instead of the 14 videos of the Where is Truth series. The title of the discussions, an introductory outline, and an index will lead you to the topics you want. The Bible and Science discussions served as the resource for the Where is Truth videos. To facilitate understanding and learning, each of the 17 PowerPoint discussions in the Bible and Science resource is provided with a set of questions and their answers. You will find these at the end of each PowerPoint presentation.